3 includes ecological genetics, which covers adaptation and natural selection, and a little bit of um, evolution. So, we're going to discuss the relationship of adaptation and natural selection, as well as its relation to evolution and how come that genetics is part of this discussion. So, in ecological genetics, it was proposed by Darwin that the organism or the diversity of organism today has something to do with with his theory of natural selection. So, in the later slides, we're going to discuss natural selection, adaptation, and evolution. So, as you can see, if you're going to um, search for natural selection, it is mostly directed to what we so called changes in the big depth of Galapagos finches. So later, what are the contributory factors that um, um, is responsible for the variations of beak depth of this Galapagos finches? So, natural selection can be defined as the differential success, which includes survival and reproduction of individuals within the population. So, natural selection is a product of two conditions. First is the variation in heritable characters. So, these are characters that are transferred from the parents to the offspring, okay, which require sexual reproduction, and of course, the variation in different individuals, which includes survival and reproduction. So, natural selections has four premises, or what we so called conditions um, that are responsible, or that are there's some of the reasons why organisms still survive, or organisms had surpassed the previous environmental conditions and exist today. First premise is variation. So member of a population have individual differences that are heritable. So which is also related to the conditions of natural selection. So natural selection won't work with clones. Ibig sabihin, there should be what we so called sexual reproduction, which is the key of having variations from one generation to the next. Okay, it is because of the combination of genes of the parents, which is or which can be manifested with the new generation or the offspring. So next premise is over reproduction. So natural populations reproduce geometrically. So organisms tend to produce offspring more than it survives. So one of the adaptations of other organisms is to produce large amount of offspring in order for some or few, or there are instances that most of its offspring that is produced is affected by environmental condition, but then since there are a lot of offspring being produced, so there is or lesser tendency that any of those produced offspring will not survive. Okay, so that's overproduction. So mapoproduce ang organism ng maraming offspring, but you will not expect na lahat ng offspring na produce niya ay magsasurvive. But it will not be zero. Some are will be surviving. So that is one of their means or mechanism. Next, we have competition. Competition, individual competes for limited resources, particularly the food, or it can also be their partner or their mate. So, struggle for existence, that is actually the term used by Darwin for this premise. So, they struggle for existence or to survive. They fight for their own food. Okay. So that's competition. And of course, the last one, you have survival to reproduce. So only an organisms or individuals that are better suited to the environment will survive and reproduce. Okay, it's not only survive but also to perpetuate their own or their species or their kind. So there should be reproduction. So dito papasok yung tinatawag mong survival of the fittest, wherein fit individuals pass on to a portion of their offspring the advantageous characteristics. So these characteristics correspond to the advantageous genes which is acquired by the offspring through reproduction or sexual reproduction. Okay. So, the fitness na sinasabi doon sa survival of the fittest is actually the contribution of the organism to the next generation. So, those contribution primarily centered to the advantageous genes that is being passed through to the next generation. So, there are four premises. You have variation, overproduction, competition, and survival to reproduce. Okay. So, in terms of evolution, evolution is the process by which the properties of the population change over generation or over a long period of time. So, in various references, evolution is defined differently. So, the first also definition of evolution, according to Darwin, is the descent with modification, wherein he gave an example. You have an ancestral population which provides or gives way to the descendant population. So these descendant population have a variety of traits. Okay, so there is emergence of variety of traits producing different descendant population, which causes what we so called diversity. However, this descendant population with diverse traits are unified because of their ancestral population or kung ano yung population na pinanggalingan nila where they evolved. Okay? So another definition, evolution is a process of change through time. So evolutionary changes may be in the form of its morphology, physiology, biochemistry or biochemical changes, behavioral changes, ecological changes, and of course you have the genetics. Okay. So, others would say that evolution is a process of change within the genetic structure of a population through time. So that's it. That's very that's the very important thing in the process of evolution, where you can actually um, relate evolution to natural selection and of course to adaptation. So, adaptation is a heritable trait that develops in response to environmental conditions. Okay? So, sinasabi ng other references that evolutionary change is called adaptation. So, how come that evolutionary change is also called as adaptation? So, when you say evolutionary change, it is actually phenotypic trait that has been favored through time, or actually a phenotypic trait, okay, pagbuo or the change in the phenotypic trait that has become favored through time, or ibig sabihin that certainly adapt to or certainly exist through time, okay, will be able to surpass environmental changes. So paano naging adaptation ang evolutionary change? It is because evolutionary change enables the population to cope with the changes in the environment. And when you say adaptation, there are other forces of evolution, but natural selection is the only evolutionary mechanism that can produce adaptation. Kaya tinatawag nga siyang na, um, evolution by natural selection. And of course, our adaptations are product of natural selection. Okay. So, in terms of genetics, um, genes are the basic or physical functional unit of inheritance. So, ibig sabihin, if there are changes in the genes, upon the changes in phenotypic trait, so this is responsible for the changes in some of the aspects of organisms. Okay, that is actually what we so called uh, environmental influences. Okay, so similarities is just a simple review of genetics. So, similarities and differences among organisms are outcomes of the information contained within the DNA. So, a gene is a length of DNA that contributes to the formation of protein through gene expression. And you have the alleles or the variant genes. Okay, so a gene that exists in different forms, you have alleles, and of course you have the DNA in cells, which have the genome. You have the actually in a chromosome. Okay, so you will discuss this organization of genetic material in your genetic subject. So, what is the importance of genes in the process of adaptation and, of course, the process of natural selection? So the population of the species is typically composed of a local population called subpopulation, wherein there is what we so call the genetic differentiation. So within these subpopulations, yun yung very evident yung tinatawag na genetic differentiation. We have also the term gene pool, which is the sum of the alleles of individuals in a population. So pag sinabi mong gene pool, it is the collection of different genes within an interbreeding population. So lahat ng gene variations or genetic variations na nag-exist within the population, that is actually the gene pool. And talking about gene pool, you have two frequencies related to it. You have allele frequency and you have genotype frequency. When you say allele frequency or allele or gene frequency, so that is the relative frequency of allele within the population, a particular locus in a population. And you have the genotype frequency, yun yung proportion ng genotype or frequency ng genotype in a population. So that is this is very important. This is because the genotype is being expressed in the form of phenotype. So the frequency of the genotype actually can represent the frequency of a specific phenotype within the population. Okay, so phenotypic evolution is a change in the mean variance of a phenotypic trait as a result of allele frequencies. So, dito, in this case, natural selection acts in the phenotype. Okay? It acts on the phenotype. It is because when you say phenotype, this is the combination of genes, nandun yung tinatawag mo na genotype frequency, and of course, the environmental influences. So, ang phenotype ng isang organism, okay, kung pag-uusapan natin yung formation ng phenotype, it is the combination of the genes or the effect of gene or the composition of genetic material at the same time environmental influences. Hindi mo masasabi na it is only environmental influence that affects the phenotype of the organism. It is because in that particular component or aspect na environmental influence, it will not be inherited by the next generation. Okay? So it should be genes at the same time environmental influences. Okay. So how can you relate natural selection to evolution? Okay? Natural selection acts on the phenotype, but what it connects it to evolution is actually the genotype. Okay? So the genotype that it makes it mechanism of evolution. So since you have the phenotype and phenotype also at the same time, if you try to act or to change phenotype, you are also changing the allele frequencies. Kasi nga, kung babalikan natin, ang phenotype, combination ng gene at ng environmental influences. Kung nagbabago ka ng phenotype ngayon and natural selections act on the phenotype, so it also acts on the genotype or in the allele or in the genes. At the same time, may kasamang environmental influences. Since nakaka-change siya ng genotype, Okay? Yung mechanism na yun, dun papasok yung tinatawag na evolution. Kaya, tinatawag siyang evolution by natural selection, and the product of it was what we called adaptation. Okay, so I hope that's clear. Within natural selection, evolution, and adaptation. Kaya it's complete to have evolution by natural selection, which produce actually various adaptations of the organisms. For example, if you have this particular figure, you have the number of finches as well as the beak depth, so you will expect that higher proportion of organisms or higher number of finches has this um, beak depth. So you will expect that it has this particular phenotype, and of course, that phenotype, okay, is the expression of the genotype. So may mga frequencies, okay, ng phenotype, yan, frequencies ng phenotype within the population of finches. So that particular phenotype, okay, accompanied with changes in the genotype or the genes of the organism. Okay. So in this figure, you can see the offspring beak depth and the mid-parent beak depth. There is a linear relationship between the changes in the beak depth of the offspring and the mid-parent beak depth. So pataas, there is a linear relationship, though there are fluctuations na may observe. But then, as the offspring or the as mid-parent beak increases, tumataas din po yung depth ng offspring nila. So as you can see, as the parent changes its beak depth, okay, may changes in the beak depth, so it is being passed on with the offspring. Ganun ang nangyayari in the process. Okay. So, in terms of the beak depth, relationship with the beak depth, the seed hardiness category, ito naman yung source of food nila. So, mas mababa yung pag soft, yung seeds, or yung soft, yung seeds mismo na source of food. Mas mataas naman yung beak pag medium. Of course, if that's harder, mas mataas siya, okay, compared dito sa dalawa. Okay. So, nagbabago siya based on the characteristic of the food that they eat. Okay, so the distribution of beak sizes in the finch population change in response to extreme climate change, lalo na when the average size and hardiness of available seed increase. Okay, so they tend to, okay, nagbabago, they tend to change in order to acquire food, okay, dahil nagbabago din yung food source ng organism. Okay, so population change in response to extreme climate change, which changes its food type.